Okay, so good evening to you. Very warm welcome to the IWM. I am Ludger Hagedorn, a permanent fellow here at the Institute, and I also oversee the Patočka archive at the Institute that we harbor since the mid-1980s at IWM. This second part I do not mention so often, but tonight is a good opportunity to mention it. I'm very happy that we will continue with actually a series of events dedicated to, among other things, dedicated to the philosophy of Jan Patočka. A very warm welcome to you, David. Thanks for joining us on this occasion. I mentioned this is actually a series of events. We will continue with another talk tomorrow by James Dodd. James is also here. Welcome, James. Very good to have you back at IWM. And we will continue on Friday morning at the Faculty of Theology at Vienna University with a book presentation of the book by Martin Koci, Faith After Christianity, Thinking Faith After Christianity. And a round table discussion at the faculty. So this is a very good theological tradition. It's a tripartite event. And the good thing about it is that all three events work individually, but obviously the best is to experience all three of them. So this is a strong recommendation. Very warm welcome again. And I have to, I have one very important task this evening, and that is to thank you, Katerina Koci, who has organized not only tonight but the whole series of events. Katerina Koci is a Lise Meitner Fellow, and with this Lise Meitner Fellowship working at the Institute in the second year now. Katerina, I'm very happy that you are joining us at the Institute for this fellowship. Her project is called Woman Without a Name. It's about gender identity in sacrificial stories. Katerina is a theologian by education, and these sacrificial stories are also, this is also relating to biblical stories of sacrifice, but also to non-biblical stories. And this, let's call it workshop, or this series of events is also a bit centered around the idea of sacrifice, very much so in the talk by James tomorrow and also the workshop on Friday. Katerina, it's great that you're doing this. Thank you very much for organizing it, and I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I am really honored to be here at the Institute, and also it's a pleasure for me to organize the lectures and the workshop. And now it's my task to introduce our today's speaker, David Lloyd Dusenbury, who is a philosopher and historian of ideas, whose books include The Innocence of Pontius Pilate and Platonic Legislations. His next book, I Judge No One, with a very promising title, A Political Life of Jesus, is forthcoming with Hurst and London and Oxford University Press in New York later this year. Currently, he is a visiting fellow at Budapest's Danube Institute and visiting professor at Eötvös Loránd University. This was my first Hungarian in my life. He writes for the Times, a literary supplement, La Lettura, and others. David, the floor is yours, and we are looking forward to hearing your lecture today.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for the warm words and the invitation. And I must say, it's a great pleasure and an honor to be here where Patočka's archives are held, and the remembrance of his thought is carried forward, and where a number of true leading specialists in his philosophy are gathered. So I greatly look forward to your thoughts and impressions, and perhaps criticisms in the moments that follow. My remarks. So it seems to me that the last of the heretical essays is misunderstood, and thus the task I've set myself in this evening's lecture is to correct what I take to be this misunderstanding, which is, of course, importantly different from offering an exhaustive or anything like a final interpretation of the sixth essay. My hope is much more modest than that. So the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur is shocked by the last pages of the Heretical Essays, which he deems to be strange and, in many respects, frightening. Writing after Ricoeur and citing him, Jacques Derrida faults the Czech philosopher for what he calls his exceptional and troubling glorification of the front, meaning, in the first instance, the hellish combat lines of the First World War. Derrida even hints that Patočka's tone becomes maniacal in the course of the essay we're considering this evening. More recently, citing both Derrida and Ricoeur, Nicholas de Warren, whom I count as a friend, I think he's a friend of many here, former colleague, Nicholas stresses the strangeness of the last heretical essay. He says that much of the essay's argument seems to be not only foreign to certain orthodoxies of modern European thinking, but equally strange to the philosophy articulated by Patočka. De Warren suggests that the argument of the last essay is unanticipated by that of the preceding five. Now, I want to underscore that de Warren, Derrida, and Ricoeur are eminent philosophers who offer their own subtle and important readings of the sixth essay. I don't pretend to do them justice. I don't pretend to engage their own interpretations. But rather, I want to set out by simply from the fact that Patočka's war heresy, as de Warren calls it, has met with confusion and misunderstanding. So we can begin by asking, why is this? I think Patočka's lyricism may be to blame. He indulges in highly evocative statements in the last pages of his books, and his mystic prose can seem lurid in the context of 20th century hecatombs, which is what Patočka calls the two world wars. Thus, after de Warren notes that many of Patočka's reflections in this essay elicit unease, he asks, what are we to make of this pointed claim behind me on the screen? Patočka writes, war can show that among the free, some are capable of becoming gods, of touching the divinity of that which forms the ultimate unity and mystery of being. Well, what are we to make of this divinization, this weird divinization of those who kill and perhaps die in war? Isn't this exactly what Derrida calls a troubling glorification of the front? What else could it be? Until we have an answer to this last question, what else could it be? I think we will not have understood the heretical essays. So we're going to return to this question in my conclusion. Here we can begin by noting, as many or all of you know, that Patočka's stated desire in writing the heretical essays is to offer, quote, a different basic conception of history, which I take to mean one that differs from materialist and determinist conceptions that were dominant then and arguably still are. So one of the questions raised by the last heretical essay is, did Patočka articulate a different conception of history, or did he merely return in this last essay to certain currents, dark currents, in early 20th century European literature? Professor de Warren writes, for instance, Patočka's reflections in the sixth essay can be seen as a troubling instance of the veneration of the front experience that flourished during and after the First World War, eventually becoming appropriated into the war ideology promoted by the Nazis during the 1930s. Now, I want to note that de Warren himself does not see the sixth essay this way, but he recognizes, as we are now recognizing, that this is one possible impression one could take. I think it would certainly be strange if Patočka concluded his, what I take to be a Platonic Christian theory of history with a fetishization of the front experience from 1914 to 1918. And I think it would be much stranger if he sank to the level of a Nazi-Zeit war ideology, a term, Kriegsideologie, which is thought to have been coined by Thomas Mann. This would, I underscore, be strange, but we nevertheless have to face the question: is the conclusion of Patočka's Heretical Essays in some way tainted by Nazi tropes or Nazi currents of thought? Is his philosophy of the soul's history in Europe a strange form of passé war ideology? I am convinced it is not, but the only way to show that it is not is to reconstruct in the coming moments what it is. And in the process of doing that, we'll also see that the sixth essay is not perhaps as strange or unanticipated as some of his interpreters have found it. In this essay, Patočka deplores Europe's incomparably destructive world wars, and I think advances his Platonic Christian philosophy of history. I use these terms in a very, very broad sense. Even when he writes, as we have heard, that machine-centered war can reveal that some are capable of touching the divinity of that which forms the ultimate unity and mystery of being. Note this last phrase, it's a clue. There is much in Patočka's first 5 heretical essays about the mystery of being. But here in the 6th essay, he introduces a new concept, namely that of, quote, the ultimate unity of being. And I suggest that it is an experience of the unity of being which Patočka hopes might carry us beyond the dooms of war, but only if this unity of being is recognized as a mystery. With this for introduction, as you see, the lecture has 2 parts and a conclusion. The first part is a reflection following Patočka on the cause or causes of the world wars. And the second, we sort of explore Patočka's striking question, why haven't the world wars caused the sort of conversion he thinks we need? And in the conclusion, finally, we will ask, what is the conversion that Patočka thinks we need? So, part 1, some of you may recall from your reading of the Heretical Essays that the concept of myth figures saliently in the 5th Heretical Essay on technological civilization and the question of decadence. The concept of myth is present too in the 6th essay, which he titles Wars of the 20th Century and the 20th Century as War. Patočka opens this essay with several assertions, and we read in the very first sentence, the First World War was an immense event transcending any individual, carried out by humans, and yet transcending humankind, a process in some sense cosmic. Now, if this strikes us as a quasi-mythical formulation, I think it is meant to, for later in the essay, Patočka reminds us that conflict is the great instrument which, mythologically speaking, force used in its transition from potency to actuality. In this process, humans as well as individual peoples are merely tools. Is not precisely this, he asks, the cosmic sense of warfare, which he evokes, I think, in the opening sentence of the essay. So what are we to conclude from this? A number of things. First, when Patočka refers to the First World War as an event which transcends humankind, I don't think it's empty rhetoric. He seems to believe that there is an archaic concept, force, which has a sort of demonic influence in the world wars. Patočka is not entirely convinced, it seems to me, that the world wars are merely something that humans did. Rather, he intimates that they were something which happened to us, titanic fits of destruction which were inflicted upon us. It is perhaps because of this sense of the deep inner logic of the world wars, a logic that is not wholly governed by what Patočka calls the awesome will, he means a human will, which for years drove millions of humans into a fiery furnace. It's also partly influenced by an archaic force which is utterly indifferent to human life or death. It seems to me that this thought leaves Patočka unimpressed with more doctrinaire theories of the origins of the 2 world wars. In what may be his bluntest, or one of his bluntest critiques of Marxist historiography, at least in the Heretical Essays, Patočka writes of a conviction which spread that some sort of Marxist explanation of the world wars must surely be hidden in the conceptual treasuries of the party. No one seemed to mind, he says, in reality, that there are no such explanations. Now, Patočka does not simply mean, on my reading of this passage, that there is no convincing Marxist, exhaustively convincing Marxist explanation of the world wars. He seems to be pointing rather to the fact that in his mind there are no such explanations. He denies in 1975 that we fully understand what occurred in those incomparably destructive conflicts, and his conjuration of a quasi-mythical concept of force is a sign that, for him, more rigorous and profane methods of analyzing the origins of the world wars are inadequate.
Who is the second man on this picture? It is Stalin and Gottwald. What? Gottwald.
First Czechoslovak, the first communist president of Czechoslovakia.
I didn't know it.
Thank you. Thank you. And please, if there are any other questions as we proceed. So the inadequacy of rationalistic theories of the world wars is also suggested by a sentence which has perplexed some of Patočka's commentators. He writes, the idea that war itself might be something that can explain, that war has itself the power of bestowing meaning, is an idea foreign to all philosophies of history, not just the Marxist, and so also to all explanations of the world wars which we know. Now, the Greek word for war is polemos, and it's this Greek word that sort of hovers over the sixth essay and is certainly in Patočka's mind when he later writes, as we're hearing now for the third time, and we'll hear again later on, that war can show that some humans are capable of touching the divinity. In both cases, what is crucial to my argument is that Patočka is trying to deploy a mythical concept philosophically. He wants us to think of force and of war as archaic structures which lie beyond the final control of humankind and which periodically come to control us. He wants us to think of force and of war as cosmic realities which, in a sense, transcend us. Nevertheless, Patočka has by no means forgotten his critique of technological civilization, which is laid out in the fifth heretical essay. So, though he detects a quasi-mythical force which is dispersed within the machine structures and deployed in the human masses which carried out the world wars, which is what we've just been talking about, he also very clearly sees that both world wars were the consummation of a modern cult of the machine in Europe. As you see here, what the world wars demonstrated, he writes, is that the transformation of the world into a laboratory for releasing reserves of energy accumulated over billions of years can be achieved only by means of wars. The wars represented, therefore, a breakthrough of this conception, this modern conception of being, which he ascribes to Francis Bacon. The modern conception of being, he says, swept aside all the so-called conventions. He does not believe they're mere conventions, thus the scare quotes, swept aside all the conventions that inhibited this release of energy, a transvaluation of all values under the sign of power. One such sign is on the screen. Patočka concludes from this that the energetic transformation of the world in late modernity must take on the form of war because war is the most intensive means for the rapid release of accumulated forces. So, Patočka's quasi-mythical concept of force is redescribed in the preceding paragraphs as a technological concept. This is one way in which a mythical concept can be described philosophically. The energies which machines capture and release have intrinsic qualities which can be super efficiently released in war, which is to say in situations of spectacular destruction. There is therefore a structural and, as it were, an energetic propensity to conflict in our technological civilization, and Patočka is suggesting that the world wars merely revealed this potentiality. So if the world wars have causes which are both mythical and technological, Patočka believes they're also organizational. He writes in the 5th essay that in a technological civilization, humans, like all else, are stripped of all mystery. This he takes to be a feature of the organizational logic of modernity. And the model of this organizational logic in the 6th essay is Germany. Now, in the coming moments, I'm going to say quite a lot about Germany. This is not the only country that Patočka talks about, but I focus on this because of the question which led into this evening's lecture, namely whether there are dark currents stemming ultimately from Germanic war ideology in the 6th essay. So the model of the modern organizational logic is Germany. It is in Germanic lands, writes Patočka, that a managerial mode of work and thought took hold in the mid to late 19th century, and a breakneck revolution occurred. I find it quite interesting. Patočka argues that France was the revolutionary European nation par excellence of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. This is not very controversial, but this is a bit more interesting. He argues that Germany was the revolutionary European nation par excellence of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Long before the First World War, he writes, Germany had already transformed Europe into an energetic complex, which is to say, into a technological complex with, as I just indicated, an energetic propensity to war. Much more could be said, and I'm skipping over some material, but Patočka stresses that a revolution took place in pre-war Germany, which had conspicuous scientification as its driving force, a sort of positivism which for the most part managed to neutralize the Germany of the old fading empire, which for him is the Holy Roman Empire, with its traditions of history, theology, and philosophy. So for Patočka, it is not a paradox, but rather an organizational fact that, quote, conservative Prussia and its military caste, with its ossified bureaucracy, its incredibly narrow-minded Lutheran orthodoxy, was the bearer and agent of world revolution in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And this is without referring to the fact that the Germany which Patočka has just described actually sent another agent of world revolution, namely Lenin, from Switzerland to Russia. So Patočka suggests that the French in this period were humanized by their desire for individual life. He contrasts this with the Germans. Patočka can hardly be thought to be echoing a Kriegsideologie literature when he faults modern Germans, echoing, I think, a certain Nietzsche who pours contempt on Germans of the 1870s for, quote, domineering rudeness and a total absence of imagination. Again, why do I cite this material? Because it demonstrates to my mind that Patočka is certainly not echoing bellicose German or European tropes in his last heretical essay. The following lines from the 6th essay should, it seems to me, terminate any question of Nazi influences or echoes in Patočka's thought. The question with which my remarks opened, what Germany had begun, he writes, the transformation of the global status quo finally came about, and the result of this is nothing but the definitive collapse of Europe. For a European thinker such as Jan Patočka, one who believes that care for the soul gave rise to Europe, the wildly destructive Germanocentric history, which I've just sketched for you, can reflect nothing but a profound deformation of the culture of the soul in Europe. And it does reflect this for Patočka, which brings us to our second part. If Patočka's question of what caused the world wars is one of destroying potential, he also formulates a question about the saving potential. These are his words of both world wars. note two things. First, this saving potential is emphatically not political. It has nothing to do with the concrete political objectives of any of the warring states, certainly not those of Germany in the Second World War. And second, according to Patočka, this saving potential has not been realized. It is precisely the failure of the two wars' saving potential which leads Patočka to ask, why this grandiose experience alone capable of leading humankind out of war into a true peace has not had a decisive effect, of course this is 1975, on the history of the 20th century, even though humans have been exposed to it twice for 4 years. Why have the wars not unfolded their saving potential? Why have they not played out in a role somehow analogous to that of the fight for peace after the Great War? In other words, it seems to me Patočka is asking in this passage why the Cold War, or as he prefers to call it, and I quite like this expression, the smoldering war. Why did the Second World War conclude not with a true peace, as he phrases it here, but rather with a sort of untrue war? Of course, the coldness of the Cold War is conditioned by what Patočka calls the nuclear reality, which I think is something which we should bear in mind in the 2022, the current year. He alludes to a Hiroshima complex, a post-war feeling of spectacular intensity, namely a fear that humans could precipitate the end of the world. Very well, the nuclear reality may explain why the Cold War is cold, but Patočka is asking a deeper question, and that is why there is a war. He's troubled by the fact that after two outrageously destructive global conflicts, there is still not a real peace in Europe. And here, it seems to me, his reflections become quite contemporary. I don't think they're nullified by the end of the Cold War, roughly a decade after his death, nor are they superseded by the first stirrings of what some, sadly, are calling a Second World War. Patočka's basic claim is that post-war Europeans continue to be fascinated by force. This is an echo in the 6th essay of his critique of the modern metaphysics of force, and the 5th essay, which he also calls a deification of force, which is a term which the theologians among us might find of some interest. He writes, which is a very strong formulation, force is the highest being for late moderns. This is, for Patočka, our technological civilization's theology or post-theology. In part, then, the quasi-mythical hold that force has on us, as I argued in the first part of the lecture, is of our own making. Our belief that force is the highest being is what makes us susceptible to the demonic influence of force. And when I say demonic, Patočka defines demons in the Heretical Essays as influences which deepen the human self-estrangement to which, on the other hand, they point. So he gives this language of the demonic, which I'm using, a phenomenological and a philosophical sense. Force, it seems to me, according to Patočka, is the false god of modern Europe, and it is because Europeans still, 1975, deify force, that force has come to have a demonic hold over us. War is an ineliminable effect or moment of force. The forces that our machine systems capture must and will be released. Patočka warns that because of this, war as a means of releasing force cannot end. And he writes that his deepest objection to late modernity's deification of force is that it is deceptive. He writes, we continue to be fascinated by force. We allow it to lead us along its paths, making us its dupes when we believe we have mastered it and depend on it for security, when in reality we are losing a war, which it has cunningly convinced us we are winning. So why has the war not ceased? Why do we have a smoldering war in Europe in 1975? Because war as a means of releasing force cannot end, and technological civilization is ordered by a metaphysics of force. In other words, it seems to me, Patočka is arguing, with a very conscious echo of Francis Bacon, where knowledge is power, there will be war. Yet Patočka recognizes that there's something strange about the ineradicability of war. I assume we'll all know this, this film from 1930. For humans tire of war, and many hope for peace and strive for peace. Life would like so much to live at last, he says, but it is precisely life itself which gives birth to war and cannot break free of it with its own resources. This last phrase is really what leads us, begins to lead us to our conclusion. So life cannot break free of war with its own resources. Patočka seems to be evoking here a concept from the very first pages of the Heretical Essays, namely the bondage of life to itself. But I'm actually going to pass over these paragraphs and say rather that it is time for us to consider the place of death in Platonic conversion. There's a remarkable passage in the 5th essay. So here, as we move into the conclusion, I'll be looking a bit at the 5th, a bit at the 3rd essay, while still absolutely centered on the 6th. Patočka writes, the Platonic philosopher overcame death not by fleeing from it, but by facing up to it. Platonic philosophy was melete tonatou, care for death. Care for the soul is inseparable from care for death. It is only thus that we can have a true care for life. Life eternal, again, note the highly evocative language. Life eternal is born of this direct look at death. Only because it faces up to death, the soul is absolutely free, that is, chooses its destiny. In this text, I think we can see something which illuminates the rather obscure claim, which I've just read from the 6th essay, namely that life desires to live in peace, and yet gives birth to war and cannot break free of war with its own resources. Paradoxically, Patočka means that life needs the resources of death to break free from war. How could this be? Patočka reasons in the 6th essay that governments govern by means of death, by threatening life. This is the essence of coercion. Coercion, one could argue, is the essence of law, and so on and so forth. In this picture, which I've just read, death is certainly not liberatory. On the contrary, Patočka calls death the means of maximal human unfreedom. He suggests in the 6th essay that it is the terror of death which drives humans into fire on the front lines. Death chains humans to life and renders them most manipulable. This is not the sense of death that he is appealing to. Patočka thinks that what divides a Platonic philosopher's or a Christian saint's, etc., relation to death from that of one who is chained to life is precisely the question of whether death is faced. Death only makes us manipulable, according to Patočka, when it is a force from behind. He uses the Latin phrase vis a tergo. Once we turn to face it, which is literally one sense of the word conversion, death makes possible what he calls a true care for life. Stated differently, Patočka believes that it is precisely life itself which gives birth to war, and that life cannot break free of war as long as life is in bondage to itself, in bondage to the imperatives of life. It is only a true care for life, and a life that is free, that can break free of war, and in order to break free of war, and in order to become free, humans must face death. Again, in a kind of literal register, they must convert. Patočka ultimately believes that the world wars did not end all wars because we have not converted. The inner experience of war did not break Europeans' fascination with force. It did not free us from our bondage to life, in the terminology of his first Heretical Essays. However unrealistic this conclusion might seem, it is not unanticipated in the Heretical Essays. In the 3rd essay, Patočka expresses a hope for what he calls a, quote, gigantic conversion in Europe. I argue that his hope is unchanged in the 6th essay, which brings us to our conclusion. What is the conversion we need if we're to live free and if a true peace is to be possible? The wars that led to the collapse of Europe are by no means glorified in Patočka's Heretical Essays, nor for that matter are many of the wars that led to Europe's rise in the early modern period. He has very strong criticisms against the colonial era and so on and so forth in the Heretical Essays. In the second essay, Patočka cites Augustine of Hippo's critique of a human lust to conquer, libido dominandi, a phrase that Augustine actually takes from Sallust. In the fourth essay, Patočka criticizes the birth of a new life in early modern Europe in which care for the external world and its conquest rather than care for the soul became the dominant concern. So, as I hope you will by now be convinced, there seems to me to be no echo of war ideology in the sixth essay by Jan Patočka. He is programmatically critical of the modern national, technological, imperial cultures which immolated themselves at the flaming lines of Europe more than once in the 20th century. Notably, as I've tried to indicate, Patočka recognizes that Germany played a crucial role in both world wars. He denounces the Germans' fostering of hate and inconceivable acts of revenge and ressentiment, which I take to be a reference to the death camps and Holocaust of the Second World War. For these and other reasons, it seems to me unconscionable for Patočka to be seen as any sort of apologist of war. I take him to be a philosopher of European peace. And yet, Patočka does write in the Heretical Essays' final pages that the world wars revealed some humans are capable of touching the divinity, as we've heard a number of times, of that which forms the ultimate unity and mystery of being. He does take inspiration from a remarkable text by a Catholic intellectual, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, translated into English beautifully by Nicholas de Warren, titled Nostalgia of the Front. In this text, Teilhard writes, "Nothing except the front will give me the kind of freedom that intoxicated me in 1917. For Patočka, I want to argue, this sort of first personal reflection by a man of Teilhard's stature is not an instance or an element of war ideology, it is a phenomenon. This is Teilhard writing in 1917 when he is still within sight of the front. And he says in the same passage, Teilhard says that when the peace will come which is desired by all, and first of all desired by me, nevertheless, something like a light will abruptly become extinguished on earth. Those who lived and died at the front, he says, experienced a freedom greater than their own. They were exalted to the edge of the world, near in the proximity to God. It is Teilhard's mysticism of the front which seems to me to lie behind Patočka's claim that the world wars revealed that humans are capable of touching the divinity in extremis. And for Patočka to claim this, I repeat, is not ideology but phenomenology. For all its horror, war is revelatory. Why? Because in war, this is my concluding argument. Why is war revelatory? Because in war, as in Platonic philosophy and in Christianity, humans face death. And in war, humans are shaken. It is not possible for Patočka to deny this liberatory potential or saving potential even of modern machine-centered war, machine-driven war, because it is attested by men like Teilhard, who, far from being some sort of German ideologue, was actually facing the Germans at the front. So, the liberatory potential of war is not a theory, it's not a delusion, it is a phenomenon. The question then becomes, what is a philosopher of peace, such as Patočka, to make of this phenomenon? This returns us to the question of what he means when he writes that war reveals that some humans are capable of touching divinity at the front lines. What is this divinity? What does it mean to touch it? And how Crucially, how could the liberatory experience of war lead us beyond the dooms of war, that is, to a true peace? Let us recall how Platonic philosophers are described in the Heretical Essays. They overcame death not by fleeing from it, but by facing up to it. Those at the front, who in modern warfare are not the elite, but rather the masses, they're given an occasion to face death, and like a philosopher or a Christian saint, according to Patočka, they're given a chance to overcome death. Now, if Christianity is Platonism for the masses, as Nietzsche says, I argue that Augustine says this rather clearly, but Nietzsche definitely says it and Patočka likes it. If Christianity is Platonism for the masses, then the world wars, for all their horror, offered some sort of possibility of a Platonic conversion of the masses. Life eternal, as we've already heard, is born of the direct look at death. This claim by Patočka makes it not so strange that the experience of modern war might offer an experience of eternity for the masses in the 20th century. But the crux of Patočka's theory of Platonic conversion and indirectly of European culture, which he takes to derive from a certain Platonism, is that, in his words, care for the soul is inseparable from care for death, which becomes the true care for life. So it is the true care for life which, like a true peace, is not in bondage to life, and it is only facing death which, if we let it, permits us to care for life and to cultivate peace in freedom. For Patočka, it is only after we face up to death that we can become absolutely free or cultivate a true peace rather than a smoldering war, a false peace. Our last question is really this. How is the conversion of one fighter, and thus the freedom of one fighter's soul, say that of Teilhard de Chardin, writing very near the lethal line, how is this related to Patočka's idea of a true and lasting peace in Europe? Well, there's an arresting passage in the 6th essay which resolves this question and brings us to a conclusion. The adversary of one who is converted at the front is a fellow participant in the same situation, a fellow discoverer of absolute freedom, with whom agreement is possible in difference, a fellow participant in the same upheaval. Here at the front we encounter the abysmal realm of prayer for the enemy, the phenomenon of loving those who hate us, the solidarity of the shaken, a phrase we all will have heard, for all their contradiction and conflict. It seems to me that this picture of enemies who are alike exalted at the edge of the world, in Teilhard's phrase, who are alike facing death, and thus who are alike offered a chance to convert, to become free, to care for life not out of bondage to life, but freely. This picture calls to mind, at least to me, a passage in the 3rd heretical essay in which Patočka is writing about the church. Here Patočka says the church is a community in which, for all its hierarchy, all humans are equal before the face of the ultimate true reality, in which they are thus true fellow participants in a meaningfulness which they did not create, but which they are called to bring about. Patočka detests and denounces the 2 world wars, but there is in them a certain divinity, a certain saving potential, for the sole reason that, at the front, as in the church, in Patočka's mind, all humans are equal before the face of the ultimate reality. At the front, that reality is death. In the church, too, it is death through which believers hope to be saved by God. At the front, as in church, humans are forced to dwell with and in the knowledge that, in Patočka's words, life leans out into the night. There's more, but I think I'll conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for such a rich and inspiring talk. And I have now the very ungrateful task to comment, even though I am sure that there are already questions and circulating in the minds and so on, but I will try to continue in your recovery of Jan Patočka, but also recovery of Derrida and Ricoeur, those 2 ethicizing interpreters of Patočka through the concept of the solidarity of the shaken. I believe that they have indeed understood and correctly interpreted Patočka's main message in the Heretical Essays, and that is the concept of human intersubjectivity and the call to responsibility of the individual for the other. Polemos. We've heard a lot about that. War. One of the key words of Patočka's philosophy of history, and the word that also appears in the title of your lecture, David, and the title of the whole lecture series. Polemos, as the word suggests, arises in polis. It begins where people meet, live together, offer or refuse the other, help or support. It is a productive and creative power which bonds human society together and gives rise to philosophy. Polemos is the hallmark of intersubjectivity. However, it also reflects the negative aspects of human coexistence and cohabitancy, the conflict. Thus, polemos does not seek to bring beings in harmony. On the contrary, it underlines differences and calls for radical openness towards the other. Derrida's and Ricoeur's différents. However, we cannot run away before the meaning that polemos indeed bears as well. And that is, as you suggested, David, the war. For Patočka, the decisive war, which sets all the preceding war ideologies upside down, is the Great War of 1914 to 1918. All the wars that preceded World War I were conducted for some reasons, believes Patočka, religious, political, or otherwise. And despite the bloodshed they produced, there was something behind to be achieved, even if the reasons were highly dubious. Patočka, influenced by his studies of Comenius, gives the example of the 30-year War, which left Europe in the real wretched state. Millions of war casualties and millions more died because of poverty and illnesses. Patočka acknowledges religious and political reasons of this conflict without, of course, justifying them. The Great War, however, does not follow any reason. I believe, David, that you have presented this case very well in your talk. I could only add that the purpose of its outbreak is the fatigue and untenability of the Prussian Empire, while the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand d'Este by the underaged Bosnian-Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip was only a red herring, as if the reason for the Great War was basically the war itself. Against this background, Patočka writes the last of his heretical essays, entitled The Wars of the 20th Century and the 20th Century as War, which Ricoeur characterizes, as we heard already, as frankly shocking. To what extent was shocked Ricoeur himself, however, remains a question to me. Ricoeur, as well as Derrida, in my view, try hard to understand Patočka's unique and shocking interpretation. It is true that Patočka is criticized for the glorification of war and polemos as the new standards of the search for meaning. However, these perspectives are understandable if we embrace Patočka's understanding of the war, namely the existential drama of individual human being in intersubjective relations, the Frontline Experience. Patočka, as you rightly observed, David, reverses the Marxist perspective and looks at those who participate in bones and flesh in the conflict, not anonymous forces of history, political superpowers, military strategies, but concrete individuals who experienced the horror of trenches. These went through the darkness of the night, that is, a total shattering of meaning, the touch of nihilism. And indeed, nihilism could have been a result. Yet Patočka is keen to find another interpretation of the front, the Aufhebung of the negative and its transformation into positivity. The experience of the front throws the fighting soldiers on the same side of the conflict. They are driven to the polemos, which is not about the strategic moves on the battlefield, but about the drama of human existence. The war, polemos, discloses a new insight, the one which the heroic narratives about the sacrifice for the fatherland cover, that is, understanding of the crude grammar of being human, the experience of shakiness. Shakiness before finitude, before the question of meaning, before the other. Shakiness means to discover history as my history. The I is not a piece of cosmos, regardless whether chaotic or well organized. It is not a source for accumulated forces. The person is a creative force of history, and this creative force realizes itself in individual existence. The question of the philosophy of history, the question of meaning, is nothing less but finding herself in the world. The community formation is a logical consequence of the experience of being shaken. When the I is shaken, when this ability to search for meaning from within history is awakened, embraced, put into action, then the solidarity with the others and from the others who fight the meaninglessness of a precarious world bring together. True, to paraphrase Heidegger, one is always shaken as an individual. Nobody can be shaken in place of me, and nobody can, in fact, take on my shakiness. One is always shaken as an individual, but never alone. To be shaken is to be shaken with. This is also an echo of the gift of death. The main message which, in my view, Derrida strived to deliver, also by discussing Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, right after discussing Patočka, maybe surprisingly to some, in the reversed order. First Patočka, then Kierkegaard. But it is in any case a brilliant link which puts these two existential phenomenologists together and focus on the responsibility of the individual for the other. In the original sense of the Roman law, solidarity refers to the individual responsibility for the whole, in solidum. I am not standing on my own, and I am not for myself. The I is liable for the others. The question is, who are the others? The look at the history shows that the others are usually those who are like us. Hence, solidarity is traditionally derived from solidity, that is, community on firm grounds of shared identity. The most solid founding blocks are shared ethnicity, social background, and culture. To reverse the argument, a certain unity, solidity, precedes solidarity, and solidarity is effective in a community with a solid foundation. But in contrast to the solid solidarity, Patočka introduces the groundless solidarity which centers itself around the internal conflict of being human. The frontline experience or the life under the burden of a totalitarian regime are only the extreme examples which manifest universally accessible experience of all humans when they are confronted with their own finitude. There is no shared interest or common ground of the community of the shaken. Derrida, in his exposition on self-sacrifice, Donner la mort, the gift of death, recalls Patočka and Kierkegaard and interprets the concept of responsibility on the background of existential phenomenology as the need to stand up for the others, even to the point of risking one's own life. However, Patočka's interpretation suggests, unlike the one of Kierkegaard and Heidegger, in my understanding, that the night of responsibility, if I may paraphrase the Danish master, is not a solitary figure, but her act is provoked by the experience of being shaken within the community, searching for the truth and meaning. Patočka somewhat enigmatically says that the solidarity of the shaken brings together those who are capable of understanding of what life and death are all about, and so what history is about. This is not the proclamation of any gnostic knowledge or quasi-elitism. For Patočka, to know what history is about is to be aware of the chaos, the nonsense, problematicity. David, you mentioned that Patočka's philosophical project is not to be understood as a concrete political legacy. This might be true. Patočka does not offer any concrete steps towards political changes or ready-made political programs. However, he does it on purpose and even explains why, at least to my understanding. All the peace-making efforts and demobilizations of the 20th century, according to Patočka, resulted in another war because they were not aiming at maintaining the peaceful coexistence within difference, but at coming to the oppressive agreement. The very force that brought about the Great War. In other words, Patočka is convinced that human society must contain polemos, the creative and productive strife, to maintain its openness and responsibility towards the needs of all its citizens, regardless of their religious, political, cultural, and socio-economic background. Shortly, solidarity of the shaken is not a political program, but a phenomenological concept. I hope Ludger will forgive me, but I will quote him. Solidarity of the shaken is, and now I quote, a solidarity of those who have lost their trust in all positive political values such as pacifism, socialism, democracy, etc., which might serve as a common good for reshaping society, end of quote. However, it is untenable to claim that solidarity of the shaken is a pure theory which is not applicable in the real life. For example, Paul Ricoeur, again, is convinced that it was precisely the solidarity of the shaken which compelled Patočka to accept the plea to become a spokesman of the Charter 77. It was clearly a risky business from the very beginning, and which, at the end, cost Patočka his own life. The plastic people of the universe, members of a noisy music band with long hair and hippie outlook, had very little in common with the university professor who was fond of Beethoven. However, they were unjustly accused while executing their basic right to perform art, albeit it was a creative and provoking form of art. This was for Patočka a moment when he could not stay uninvolved. Even if he might not necessarily be a heroic figure welcoming martyrdom with open arms, he just could not do otherwise. For philosophy, or in Patočka's terminology, care for the soul, is never only theoretical, but also applied lifelong endeavor, which might meet a bitter end. The conversion, then, I believe, is the individual move which breaks the logic of war and instrumentalization of human life, the radical no in the form of self-sacrifice. Now, to conclude or finish, I am always grateful to thinkers who take the freedom and liberate the legacy from the dead author to provide an original interpretation, which again promise some hints for further interpretation. I admire Derrida and Ricoeur for their ethicizing approach, and I would like to thank our today's speaker, David Dusenbury, for offering yet a new light in which we may interpret Patočka's philosophy of history. And now to kick off, I have 3 questions if we still have time. You say, David, that Patočka agrees with Nietzsche that Christianity is Platonism for masses, and I am wondering if this is true. Derrida, interpreting Patočka, says that the European Christian politics has to break radically with Greco-Roman Platonic politics. And Patočka, to my knowledge, is convinced that the potential of Christianity is larger than the potential of Platonism, because it aims at joining the divine and human world by exposing the second person of the Trinity to the experience of shakiness. And in the words of Nicolas de Warren, absolute good is overcome by the absolute of God as a person. So this would be my first question. The second question, is it true that Patočka refers to Christianity? It is true that Patočka refers to Christianity as to the greatest, unsurpassed, but also unthought-through human outreach that enabled humans to struggle against the decadence. And it is well known that Patočka was in contact with Protestant theologians, for example, Josef Souček, and he quotes Catholic theologian and philosopher Teilhard de Chardin, and became himself an interpreter of Comenius, the last bishop of the Unitas Fratrum, Jednota Bratrská. However, I doubt that within the logic of his work we can understand any church as fulfilling the requirements of the community of the shaken. As far as I understand, it would rather be seen as the community seeking this oppressive unity rather than respect to otherness. Thus my question is, how do you think the concept of an imaginary, largest, unsurpassed, yet unthought through Christianity link to any church? And I'll stop with that.
Thank you very much. Very beautiful and elegant comments and difficult questions, for which I'm grateful. So you do have a third, right? If we come back to it. Now, my comment, I must say, there are those here this evening who might know the chapter and verse better than I do. My comment on Patočka's approval of Nietzsche's comment that Christianity is Platonism for the masses, I believe it appears in the 3rd heretical essay. It's a bit offhand, but he acknowledges that this is a kind of winning formulation for him. And of course, and this kind of leads into the second question, Patočka's, and again, there are those gathered here who could say more about this than I, but Patočka he is a defender of a certain Platonism. Well, I mean, negative Platonism, there's a lot that could be said. But when he is referring to a Platonism for the masses, it seems to me to be a reference to the sort of phenomenon that is on the screen, and namely that Platonism, he argues in the second essay, he appeals to the fact that both Aristotle and Plato say that philosophy begins with wonder. I confess, I mean, I'm a bit of a classicist, and I thought this was only Metaphysics 1. I thought this was Aristotle. I was surprised. I'm grateful for Patočka to pointing me to the passage where Plato talks about the connection between the originary link between philosophy and wonder. And Patočka connects this wonder with what he calls the wonder of being. And he has this absolutely marvelous phrase, I'm sure it's even better in Czech. The wonder of being is no fable. This is not a myth. This is not a story. This is not a false dogma. This is something that is real, Patočka is claiming. And so it seems to me that that he would approve of this Nietzschean formulation not in terms of the dogmatic history of Platonic metaphysics being disseminated in, reorganized and in many ways hardened and institutionally enforced forms, right, which is the history of much of the church in Europe. But rather it seems to me that he would want to say that in as much as Platonic philosophy begins with this experience of the wonder of being, and it was, as Patočka is perfectly aware, an elite experience. It was an elite project, right? He talks about the emergence of the democratic city, which is closely linked to the emergence of philosophy, but nevertheless philosophy is something which certain members of the city undertake, right? It is not a project of the city tout court or as such. And it does seem to me that he points in various passages to the fact that the church, at least in the sort of formal sense that I was talking about in my concluding remarks, contains the possibility, let's say, of generalizing this call to experience the wonder of being, to see all humans as equal before the face of the ultimate. Of course, he puts inverted commas at the ultimate true reality. So I suppose, in a sense, I was simply referring to a particular aside he makes in the Heretical Essays. And I certainly would not want to represent him as making some sort of sustained argument along these lines. But let's say that his non-disapproval of this Nietzschean line, to my mind, can be reasonably connected to other themes in the Heretical Essays, which nevertheless those connections must be made in a nuanced and critical way. So the second question, having to do with, I think this is very, very brilliant structure, because I referred to, in my interpretation, the Platonic Christian tradition in which Patočka stands. And so the first question is interrogating his connection to Platonism, and the second is interrogating his connection to Christianity. So I in a sense, I've already introduced what I would say, and that is, again, I believe it's the second, but it might be the third essay in which he lays out in a quite a kind of Heideggerian way the history of metaphysics as a sort of degeneration of the original inspiration of philosophy. So dogmatism stands opposed to problematicity, and so he wants to, it seems to me, he wants to defend the participation in a meaningfulness which humans do not create, but which they're called to bring about. This meaningfulness is not, I would say, it is not entirely lacking. I must say, I might differ. There was only one of your formulations in your very elegant remarks with which I was not entirely in agreement, when you say there is no shared interest or common ground of the solidarity of the shaken. I think this kind of absolutely negative statement does not at least agree, let's say, with my reading of the Heretical Essays, in which rather there is an experience of meaningfulness which is not created by humans, which begins, much more could be said, with humans' decision to interrogate the meaning of the whole. And of course, the interrogation of the meaning of the whole is given, right? And we are all, I think you put it absolutely beautifully, that the I is not a piece of the cosmos, right? So the I is not given, but it is, but the whole is given. And the whole, in a sense, is given to the I, to the eyes, in the experience of fundamental questioning, which is the questioning, what is the world? What is the meaning of the whole? And so it is in this way that we become participants in a meaningfulness which we are not creating, and yet this meaningfulness is only ever experienced as a problem, because it is opened by a question and it is sustained by a question. And it seems to me that this is, if I recall correctly, it's been a while since I actually gave my lectures on the 6 essays, but this is kind of the transition point between essay 2 and essay 3, where he basically says in essay 2 that the only meaning of the whole that could possibly be genuine is a human meaning. So it is somehow a meaning, a dogma, that we're responsible for. It is not given to us. And then he says, well, then can history have a meaning? Can any meaning of the whole be true if it's something we're bestowing upon ourselves? The obvious answer is no. History has no meaning if this is all that meaning ever is. But then he explores the fact that there can be meaningfulness in problematicity, in questioning, in the care for the soul, which is not a kind of pre-given meaning, a kind of dogma. So I suppose I would want to suggest that it is not the future which Patočka hopes for in continuity, and again, please disagree, but it seems to me the future Patočka hopes for in continuity with the Platonic tradition, and the future he hopes for in continuity with the Christian tradition, is certainly not contained by particular institutions or particular formulations, but nevertheless is drawn from this fundamental experience, which he does believe is intimated and at its best honored in the Platonic tradition and the Christian tradition.
Thank you. And let's open the floor for questions, if there are any. I'm sure there are. Kasper. Yeah.
Do you hear me? Yeah, it's too loud now. Yeah. I have an association. I think most of us will know the war philosophy of Hegel, yeah? Which is very similar to that what you said now about Patočka, because Hegel says that we all live in our small worlds, yeah? Which I would see in this what you said about, I have just to look at that, the bondage to life. Yeah? So everybody lives in his small world, in his borders, and he fights with the neighbor, etc., etc. And when the war, during the war and after the war, we are all shaken out of these bondages of life, and then a solidarity begins, because we are solidaric in this shakenness, which, contrary to Heidegger, is not negative, but it's the pretext for solidarity. As long as we are in our bondages, yeah, we can't be solidaric. We have no solidarity. Everybody lives for himself. So that's a philosophy of war. And this has also, I think, to do with what you spoke about eternity. Because eternity is not a long time, but eternity means to be outside the time. Yeah? And if you're really shaken out, if you speak, for instance, with people who had such a near-death experience, yeah, that's a moment of eternity. You are out of your daily business. And that's also the picture of this atomic bomb. I don't know if you know Robert Oppenheimer, who developed this bomb. When he saw the first test, he had a poem of the Bhagavad Gita where they say, I am the God who destroys everything, Erschütterer der Welten in German. So that's all this surrounding of eternity and being shaken out, but as a positive effect. Yeah.
I mean, thank you very much. I think it's a wonderful comment. I suppose all I would add in relation to the vision of, is it Vishnu in the Bhagavad Gita? Vishnu, as remembered by Oppenheimer, is perhaps, this connects rather nicely to Patočka's formulation about force being our highest being, right? The kind of deification of force is...
It has some divinity. When you look at this picture, it's really shaky. Yeah, it's interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you for that talk. I'm persuaded by your claim about war ideology, so I won't talk about that. I think it'd be more interesting to talk about some points where I was less persuaded. I think the first point has to do with the idea that it would be a philosophic flaw for there to be a shocking or unanticipated passage in a text. And so I'm wondering why that would be a problem that you would have to defend Patočka against, particularly if there's a concept of event at play. The second point has to do with the word metanoia, which is in his text, and which strikes me as a strange equivalent for conversion. I don't know offhand what the Greek is for conversion in the Republic, but I don't think it's metanoia.
Epistrophe, I believe.
Or apagage or something, but
Yeah.
I can't remember. Right, so, but metanoia is in Arendt's Human Condition, which he quotes repeatedly, and
Indeed.
it's there for forgiveness. It's the word that she kind of plucks out of, I think, Matthew, one of the words she plucks out of Matthew for forgiveness, which makes it interesting because if the conversion is more of a kind of act of forgiveness, then and if he's reading Arendt, I'm not a reader of Patočka, but if he's reading Arendt, then there's a sense in which the conversion is a release from all of the stuff you were talking about, the deification of force, the decadence, the instrumentalization of nature. And for Arendt, at least, metanoia is like a second thought or an afterthought that it's unpredictable, it's freeing, and it frees us up for a future. And so if there's a sense in which the conversion is not to be read simply with reference to Plato, but also with reference to kind of metanoia in the New Testament, then there might be this kind of like problematic of, this Arendtian problematic of freeing us or releasing us from the irreversibility of kind of modern skepticism and all of these things, and freeing us up for a relation to being that's not governed by inframing or instrumentalization. So I guess that's a comment, but it's a question, where's metanoia in the piece? So the third has to do with the prior comment, because where you end up with bondage and life and death strikes me as really Hegelian. I also thought of Hegel, but I thought of Kojev and the fight to the death in terms of slavery. So as I read Kojev, I'm enslaved to life and I'm unwilling to fight for the death, and that's what makes me a slave. And I think Patočka writes about slavery. Whereas if I'm a master, I'm willing to face death, and that's what makes me a master, is that I'm willing to die, and so I can rise above death. That may or may not be a good reading of Kojev. I think it's okay. But if it is, then the Patočka that you're producing seems really proximate to Kojev. I'll just stop there since we're Trinitarian and there I have other questions. But thank you for the commentary and
Well, I mean, I think the love of the enemy and the prayer for the enemy definitely connect to the thematic of forgiveness. But yeah, so to begin with your first objection, in a sense, I absolutely agree. I mean, to simply say that something in a philosophical text is shocking or unanticipated is, I mean, it can be a compliment as much as a criticism. So in a sense, I absolutely agree. I suppose in terms of unanticipated, which again is not what Nicholas de Warne is saying, he's rather using this language to frame his own reading. So I'm, in a sense, allowing him to set up, or I'm using the problem he takes to offer his reading in order to offer my own. but he does seem to claim that there is less continuity between the first 5 essays and the 6th than I try to lay out by quoting at the end from the 3rd and the 5th and so on and so forth. I mean, I suppose it would be not per se or definitively a weakness, but if you are going to offer a new basic conception of history, as I quoted him saying, in 6 essays, starting in prehistory and ending in the mid-20th century, and your 6th essay is kind of completely, fundamentally unrelated to what came before, that could seem to be a genuine objection. But I like your question very much. So metanoia, in a sense, I've already said something about, we could definitely discuss further afterwards. About Hegel and Kojev, I mean, he refers to, and there are those here who would know much more about Patočka's engagement with the phenomenology, Hegel, than I, but he does refer in passing early on in the Heretical Essays to the phenomenology precisely in terms of master-slave encounter. And if I am reading him correctly, it seems to me that Patočka's stress in the 2nd essay is on the absolute servility of pre-philosophical human consciousness, which gets back to the bondage to life thematic. And so his argument, based on Gilgamesh and a number of other ancient texts, is that archaic masters, according to him, are every bit as slavish in their thinking as are archaic slaves. And he does discuss slavery a bit, which falls, this is in the context in which he discusses libido dominandi, which was a Latin phrase I alluded to. So whether it's absolutely convincing or not is not my place to say, but I would think that this would be how he would distinguish his interpretation from that of Hegel-Kojev.
Yeah, thank you very much. I must say I found your lecture and your thesis extremely compelling, but I fear that due to its elegance and coherence, there's a price paid for it. Something gets lost, and I don't think it's a coincidence that sort of the names that you barely mentioned during the lecture, so to speak, the major, I would say, philosophical influences in the tradition of the philosophy of history sort of haunted and came back now in the Q&A, namely Heidegger and Nietzsche, who you briefly mentioned. Now, I think that this also, I guess, expresses itself in the sense that you often refer to the cosmic, and I think that the cosmic, we mustn't forget that the cosmic has an ontological meaning. And so the metaphysical meaning about which I'm talking is not the sort of metaphysics with a capital M that both Nietzsche and Heidegger try to sort of, dispel as a Platonian tradition, but metaphysics in the ontological sense is something that is, all-encompassing, and where Teilhard de Chardin is exactly there. What Karl Löwit called about Nietzsche's philosophy being physical metaphysics, as it were. And I think that this is extremely important in the sense that what is at stake is basically how do we enter history. You only refer to prehistory right now, right? There is this rupture, the rupture of what does it mean to enter history. For Husserl, for instance, it was the invention of science that was at stake, and that wasn't the case for Patočka, who really takes it from Heidegger, and precisely the later Heidegger is more and more engaged with Nietzsche. Now, to go back to Ricoeur, I think that a lot of the issues that Ricoeur has, and about that I want to return, that Ricoeur mentions precisely that Heraclitean polemos is what is at stake. Heraclitus also in the Heideggerian tradition as someone who faced being, straightforward, not through, the metaphysical crutches of Plato. So looking back, as you said, with Plato means to look to the prehistory, to the pre-Socratic, to look at, if you want, the unmediated access to being that is not sort of on the metaphysical crutches of Plato. Now, I think that a lot of the critique of Ricoeur comes from the fact that this is a deflationary reading of Nietzsche, basically Nietzsche under the guise of nihilism. But I think that many thinkers today realize, and I think it's right there in Nietzsche, that Nietzsche tried to overcome nihilism himself, right? And this is, I think, in many ways, precisely what Patočka himself is doing, right? He's in many ways taking Nietzsche and playing it against Heidegger himself, and sort of taking this idea of what does it mean to take polemos seriously as being itself? What does it mean to take being as becoming? What does it mean to sort of, to use a phrase that Foucault later uses when he interprets Nietzsche, to reverse the von Clausewitz term? Look at politics and history as the continuation of war and not the other way around. So this is precisely goes to what I think Katka said, in the sense that, you know, war itself, polemos, is something, it reveals something essential about being itself. It's an Ereignis in that sense, that it says something about the history of being. And much of what you refer to, like the terminology sounds a lot like Heidegger in the essay concerning technology, and about how, you know, what is the history of being? It's the various guises that we sort of cloak being with. Nature, spirit, all these things. And if it has revealed something, you know, essential, it's precisely that it's an ontological polemos. And I do very much agree with your reading, but I do think that looking back means to accept not discontinuity as a break, but the discontinuity is precisely the continuity by and through other means. This is always what is at stake. And I think that looking at like the beginning of the 20th century is precisely how do we continue after the break of metaphysics writ large, and how do we retain what we might have learned from it. So thank you for this, and I would love to hear what you make of it, because I do think that, you know, to really pull off what you're doing, and I think it's remarkable, would involve, you know, basically acknowledging, I think there are two towering figures that are really sort of emanating in the text. And I don't think it's Hegel. I think it's still very much Nietzsche with and contra Heidegger. So thank you.
Would you remember the remark? If Marianne, would you like to connect or follow up? No, okay, then
I can be brief.
Yeah, and then Marianne, and then we'll have wine and cheese.
Okay. So, no, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the comments and the questions. And I suppose conceptually, I don't disagree that especially Nietzsche, but Nietzsche and Heidegger are very much looming over the text. And Heraclitus is present on the last couple of pages, which is a name I barely mentioned. So there's a huge amount that is left out of my reading. I suppose conceptually, it seems to me that, which leads back to the previous question, it seems to me that the phenomenon or the experience of conversion is both what marks the entrance into history and what allows us to in a sense, stand in continuity with the Platonic Christian tradition without simply carrying forward the dead forms in the metaphysics with the in malam partem and so on and so forth. Returning to the essence of the tradition, not the forms. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure.
Plato
is the sophist that killed sophism, right? He is the one that gives you absolute truth, and not just a polemic of, you know, rhetoric and as this sort of polemics. And for Nietzsche, Socrates and Christ is the same thing. You know, the end of Ecce Homo, you know, have I been understood? Dionysus, you know, the god of polemos, of discord, versus the crucified as Socrates. You know, the death of Pan.
Ooh, I've actually. Now we definitely need to continue this conversation because the book I've got coming out, which was alluded to earlier this evening, opens with a discussion of Nietzsche on Socrates and Jesus. So this is something that really fascinates me.
I was just handed the microphone. But no. I did. But I understand we're short on time and we need to get to the wine and cheese. But I just wanted maybe just make a very brief comment. So this was a brilliant talk and great comments, and I very much enjoyed it. There's a lot that you put on the table, and there's a lot to think about. And just a small footnote on the Nietzsche, just a comment, is that I've always thought that I mean, there is a deep engagement with Nietzsche's thought in Patočka, but it never really satisfied me. And I've always wondered, and maybe this is a question that for those, of us who study Patočka, and this is definitely something I always bring up to people that I meet who work with Patočka, is that he has it seems to me a sort of a missed opportunity, because so many of the themes that are central to Patočka's thought are key to Nietzsche. So nihilism for one, the question of eternity. Patočka never, to my mind, comments, or to my knowledge, comments on these songs to eternity at the end of Zarathustra. He cites the night song at one point, I think, which is more about life. And so this is definitely something he wants to engage Nietzsche on. But he has a kind of the Heideggerian style end of metaphysics complaint about Nietzsche, that he's just sort of that life just becomes force, life just becomes power. And it seems to me that there's a real missed opportunity there, which is one of the reasons why Mikowski is interesting as well, as a kind of a student of Patočka's, who engages Nietzsche in ways that are both in tune with, I think, Patočka's thinking, but also runs against the grain. So I'm just making a pitch for my mentor here. But in any case, I would say thank you very much. I'm not going to, I have a lot of detailed technical questions that I could bore you with for hours, but that definitely requires several bottles of wine. So again, thank you very much for being talk.
Thank you. Maria, you had a question?
If you're out of time, it's
No.
not... Okay. Thank you also a lot for your presentation. It was also very, very, very interesting to me. I'm sorry, I'm super nervous that I have to talk in English, but I'll get right to the point of my question. You presented Patočka's view that in war we are confronted, with this being super, with this higher reality. Let's put it like that to simplify. And you also talked, about the necessity that we have to face death and everything. And this brings me, for me, this is at the core. Katerina, you already mentioned it, the question of self-sacrifice. This is really the core of morality. I mean, also even already if you look at Kant, I mean, what Kantian morals, that's the in some sense I would say it's the question of, are you ready to sacrifice yourself? I mean, you could boil it down to this. And this idea, of course, is very fascinating, but at the same time, isn't there also a huge ambiguity hidden there? Because this idea of, to put it to simplify, sacrifice yourself for the greater good is at the same time the heart of every, let's say, imperialistic and fascistic ideology. For example, if I found this very striking, the quote you had on your last slide, on this, I mean, as it stands there, it's let's say, to put it simple, very uplifting, nice. But you just have to change a few words, and you can arrive at the heart of fascist ideology. When you say the Volksgemeinschaft is a community in which, for all its hierarchy, all its members are equal before the face of the ultimate true reality. Let's say, I know the fate of our race, of the master race or whatever, and so on. That's this ambiguity of this idea of sacrifice, isn't it? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. I mean, there's so much that could be said in reply to both comments. Let me I suppose it seems to me a couple of things. I mean, one, I'm sure most of you will know this, but I was absolutely fascinated because we were discussing Nietzsche and will to power and so on and so forth. I was absolutely fascinated to learn a number of years ago that Leni Riefenstahl's first Nuremberg film was called The Victory of Faith, right? And so, yeah, even this terminology of faith, which has its, let's say, innocent or uplifting uses, can be very readily converted to concrete and malign political objectives. So in a sense, I would argue that perhaps, the lines that differentiate genuinely uplifting philosophical reflection from malign political propaganda are often rather slender. And this leads to my second thought, and that is this thematic of self-sacrifice, which I absolutely agree. There was a little more on this in the comments I cut at the end, but that's a theme on which I barely touched. But Kant, I would argue stands, I mean, you might at this point think I argue this for everything, but he stands at, you know, at kind of the high point of a very, very ancient Platonic Christian tradition. And already in the 3rd century, 2nd and 3rd century, pagan philosophers are saying, Jesus says, you know, love your enemies, turn the other cheek. And they're quoting the Platonic dialogues, which leads back to Socrates and Jesus, saying this is something you can find if you read in a certain mindset and way in the Platonic dialogues. But this leads us back to the slender line which divides. And I suppose, you know, the line that these ancient pagan philosophers point to in the Platonic dialogues is when Socrates, who was himself, it must be noted, a robust warrior, right? I mean, he was a defender of Athens, and he's praised as such. So this is all part of the picture. But the line at the heart of it all is that he says it is better to suffer wrong than to commit wrong. And so this question of the wrong, right, this question of evil, seems to me to be precisely at issue in the slender line that you're pointing to.
If I may add to this, I mean, opening a sacrifice in Patočka would be for another lecture, like distinguishing between authentic and non-authentic sacrifice. But the ultimate good that may be achieved by the authentic sacrifice, which fights, and it's the only way how to fight against instrumentalization of human beings, is freedom. So I think this kind of could be an answer to your question about the misuse of self-sacrifice. If we conceive the ultimate good as freedom, which breaks the chains of instrumentalization of human beings.
Okay, can I continue with the tradition of the tripartite questions? I'll do it the shortest possible way ever, but still just 3 very, very short remarks. David, also thank you, but I think it would need a long explanation why you call Patočka a philosopher of peace. I mean, all that you showed today is that he is definitely a philosopher of war, clearly so. If you do not want to say with that he's a propagator of peace, this is a different thing. But then we come to a very different discourse, because the secret meaning of, or the plaidoyer of Patočka in the essays is exactly that these propagators of peace are in the end factually calling for war, right? So what does it mean to be a philosopher of peace? You do not have to answer, just want to throw this out. The second point gives me the opportunity to thank you, Katka, for a really, really great comment, and I think it was great that you brought up Komensky. Very crucial to do so in this, under these circumstances, and I think this is very much underappreciated in the Heretical Essays. The heretical, I really think, is the religious heresy. This is what not the heresy to Marxism. This would have been so banal. Publishing this piece in 1974 in a Catholic dissident journal in Poland. The founder of this institute, Michalski, was influential for that. I mean, obviously, what else would it be than heretical to Marxism? But his heresy, I think, is the heresy to Christianity, and this brings back the whole Nietzsche discussion that we had just opened. I think it's very clearly so that this heresy is the heresy in a religious sense. And thirdly, once again, also only very, very short, the one thing, I don't think that it is, I mean, that I'm not so puzzled about the disinterpretations that you said that you are concerned about in Ricoeur or Derrida. But the one thing, and this is my final word, that is really, that is comforting and puzzling and frightening, maybe even frightening, is the total absence of the Second World War in Patočka's reflections. Why is it all about the First World War? Writing this in 1970, this is really a thing that needs to be explained. I haven't heard a single good explanation about that. Why is, I mean, the totally painful absence of the Shoah, there's not a single mentioning.
So you were not convinced by the line I drew your attention to?
Which
where he talks about the inconceivable acts of revenge and ressentiment. I mean, I think this is clearly a reference to the Shoah.
Well, you can read it, maybe, I mean, maybe you will find it, but do we have a single straightforward sentence? I mean, I'm asking for a single straightforward sentence on this, it's absent. I mean, this is really the painful and to me very, very puzzling aspect of these essays. But I mean, as I said, I did not want to. We are far over time, but I think this was especially a good point at the very end, maybe, because this is really frightening. Yeah.
Could I make a very brief comment?
Sure.
Which leads back to Professor Dodds' question about Nietzsche. I mean, it does seem to me there's a really fascinating contrast, and a suggestive one, at the very end of, if memory serves, it's at the very end of the 5th heretical essay. And rather surprisingly, Patočka presents his own contrast, so it's not Dionysus and the Crucified, about which I'm keen to talk much further. For him, the two figures which stand at the kind of critical juncture of European consciousness in the late 19th century, pointing the way forwards to two possible futures for a technological civilization, which he believes is what we are Friedrich Nietzsche, who is taken as a figure of will to power, first and foremost. So when he says, you know, force is our highest being, the deification of force for him connects Nietzsche to Francis Bacon. By the way, Nietzsche is a huge admirer of Francis Bacon. This is a rather neglected thematic, I would say, in Nietzsche's studies, and who stands opposed to Nietzsche and is presented far more sympathetically as someone Nietzsche actually read, which is also a rather, anyway, Dostoevsky. And so this sort of existentialist, I mean, you mentioned Kierkegaard, one hates to use this word, I don't know how else to refer to Dostoevsky, but a sort of, let's say, anguished and in a certain sense heretical Christianity coming from Russia. Of course, this is freighted with all sorts of echoes at the moment, which did not exist even 6 months ago. But I do think that I'm keen to hear much more, but I'm somewhat skeptical of the idea that Patočka would sort of, in a straightforward way, align himself with Nietzsche. At this juncture, Europe, the spiritual crisis of Europe, getting back to Husserl's title, the crisis of Europe in the late 19th century, it seems to me that he stands actually more in line with Dostoevsky.
Am I the timekeeper? I mean, I don't want to shut anyone down. I mean, it's...
Can I just make a quick response?
Yes.
Super quick. Because you're pointing exactly to the text I was So in the text, the second of the two studies in Masaryk, there's this fantastic reading of Kant's moral philosophy, critical but sympathetic and very nuanced. Just a out of the park, wonderful reading of Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov and short stories, and just really fascinating. Even in a sense, providing a whole foundation for a philosophy of love, one could say. That is in tension with, but an interesting, productive tension with that sixth essay, which was the topic of your talk. But then there's a critique of Nietzsche, which for me, that's where I'm registering my disappointment. Because it seems to me that he doesn't, as it were, provide even as a critique, as nuanced a reading and as interesting a reading as he does for Kant and Dostoevsky. And it's a mystery to me, because I expect interesting, nuanced readings from Jan Patočka. And it seems to be that in this case, I'm being provocative, but in this case, he seems to fall short of Nietzsche. And I find it quite puzzling. So, but again, I think you're right. It's Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, which for him, he identifies in the Heretical Essays that these are at the end of the 19th century, this is the point of departure for thinking about the 20th.
Thank you. So, if there are no more urgent questions.
Just one comment or short one. May I ask you, thank you for your talk, just a short comment. I read Heretical Essays quite a long ago, so which means my memory is not very well. So, but when Hegel was mentioned, Hegel always speak about the war, also about war, but always in a connection with the state. So let's say these two concepts need each other. So you cannot understand what is war without state and vice versa. But as far as I know, in Patočka's essay, there is so much talk about the war, but let's say almost nothing about the state. Is it true or not? Or my memory is bad? So this is my question, whether it is striking also for you as a reader of Patočka that someone can speak so much about a war without speaking about state, whether it is true, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so that's the comment.
Final remark?
Yeah, very briefly. This is a fantastic question, and I'm prepared for it because a friend of mine and a former interlocutor asked me a rather similar question before. It's an excellent question. My argument now would be that when Patočka is talking about the menace of death, making humans manipulable, instrumentizable, and so on and so forth, and he talks about humans being driven by a bondage to life to the flaming lines of Europe and so on and so forth, that again, just my argument, with all due respect, is just as he is not naming the state here, and he does not name the Shoah, but it seems to me that one can see that he is referring to the state and to the mechanisms of law and so on and so forth, just as I argued convincingly or not, there are other references to the Second World War which are inexplicit but nevertheless significant. So one could say a final nod to Derrida. One could say that the state kind of haunts his analysis even though it is not thematized.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, for today's lecture. Thanks to all the audience and thanks for your questions. And we will continue downstairs with our questions and talks over the wine and cheese. And one announcement, please do come tomorrow for James Dodd's lecture, which will be preceded by a film screening at 3 o'clock here. And yeah, thank you. That's all.